Good morning, good evening, good afternoon, or good day wherever you are in the world, and welcome to the next episode of No Dice, No Glory. Sponsored by our jobs that actually pay us money, we're coming to you not at all live from an abandoned arms factory deep under a mountain in West Virginia. We are proud to proffer to you the finest in wargaming coverage. Without any further ado, let's get this show on the road.
Nope. Once again, thank you, Sean, for that rousing introduction. And I think he's still married. I got a thank you card from the wedding for the waffle maker I got him. Anybody that knows me very well, if you get married, I get you a waffle maker. How good of the waffle maker you get, I guess, is my love for you. So I got him the Luftwaffe 6000 waffle maker, which is top of the line German waffle making. So today we have a real special guest here with us today. It's a guy I've known for quite some time, and I'm going to introduce him as a game designer, game developer, author, and songwriter. Welcome to the show, Ian Brown. How you doing today? Oh, and a Marine. Welcome to the show.
Hey, Mitch. Thanks for having me. Good to be here.
Thank you so much. The last podcast I did was with a enlisted Marine that did. He's retired, and he did an amazing game on miniatures, and it's about teaching gaming. It was pretty awesome. I'm plugging the old stuff too. So, Ian, tell us about yourself, and then tell us the game you played growing up that said, "This is going to be a lifelong passion of mine."
Ooh, it's going to be tough to pick it out there, but yeah. So I guess I'm still a newly retired Marine. I retired this summer out of the Krulak Center at Marine Corps University, where I spent my last 4 years in uniform. It was a fantastic experience, and I'm very grateful that I got to spend my last 4 years doing that. And by trade, I'm a CH-53 helicopter pilot. It's what I did most of my Marine Corps career, with a few stints on the ground side as a forward air controller with a infantry battalion, and then a couple of other sort of headquarters type stuff that were less interesting, but still learned some useful things that I took with me later on. And now I'm a wargame analyst at Group W, which is a small private company that does a lot of wargame and research and studies for the Marine Corps and other parts of the joint world out there.
They do some great work.
Yeah, I feel very fortunate to be part of their group over there.
Yeah, except for that Patrick McLaughlin guy. You guys are a pretty solid team over there. I love Patrick, man. He's hilarious.
Yeah, but I've only met him in person once, but I've interacted with him online all the time.
It must have been a very exhausting phone conversation. Now, he's actually a really good guy. Totally dig him. And I know he doesn't listen to the damn show, but now he'll have to refute all these horrible things we're saying about him. So,
yeah, well, I'll make sure I tag him.
Yeah, you have to. So, I said author. I also said songwriter, and they're kind of related. So, you wrote a book on Boyd and the OODA loop.
Yes, that was when did that come out? It was published in 2018. That's a long story in of itself, but yeah, that was a lot of happy accidents kind of happened to make that happen. But I'm very proud of that work. It's on the Commandant's professional reading list, at least for now.
Yeah.
Yeah, I was just saying, I wrote it initially for certain reasons, and then as it sort of developed and proliferated, I found more utility out of it. But as I got more into the wargaming, I really started thinking about how wargaming helps fulfill the orientation part of the OODA loop, which Boyd always says was the most important. And I see wargaming simply, it's a way that you can build and expand upon that to help make your decision making better.
And you wrote the OODA loop song, which is your songwriting credit, right?
If there's an OODA loop song out there, I'm very interested to hear it.
Yeah, and I never told you this too, but the book was on my desk, at on joint staff, and everybody recognizes if you've been in the military for 15 minutes, especially going through any of the PME, you recognize Boyd. And somebody goes, "Is that book good?" And I said, "Look, man, I was just surprised that a Marine knew who Boyd was." And I said, "Read it and tell me what you think." And they go, "Yeah, this is pretty good." I go, "Yeah, it's really good." And they asked me if I ever told you that. And I said, "Nah, nah, I'm going to keep it a big secret. So don't say anything to yourself about this." But it's a really good book, by the way. I like it. And actually, I think somebody in my office is reading it now because he just went to commander's course for the Marine Corps. And I think it's on there. You got to read this.
Oh,
So
well, first of all, thank you for your comments on the book. And I guess I'm partly surprised that the book is on the commander's course because nobody told me that. On
I
the
don't know
flip
if it
side,
is. I have a feeling it is.
well, I wouldn't be surprised if it was because I have found it pop up and be cited in very random places that I never expected it to be. To include, I think it was I don't know, a couple of years ago. General Glavy was at Marine Corps University. I think it was him, and he was giving it was a presentation to a different group, unrelated to anything I did at the Krulak Center. But somebody on the MCU staff was there and took some pictures and sent it to me. He was like, "Hey, you should know that the general just like threw up the cover of your book as the first slide in his presentation." And I was like, "Wow, that's fantastic. I'm glad he read it." And I had no idea that it had wound up not only on his desk but in his PowerPoint. So, um,
Yeah, the book I had to read on Boyd was Boyd. What is it good for? Absolutely nothing. No, I'm just kidding. I and for folks that don't get the inside joke, Boyd was an Air Force guy, and we are beaten to death about Boyd, and it just warmed my heart to see a Boyd book written by somebody that didn't wear blue. But you were a Marine flyer, so I
ye- yeah, well, it's funny though you mentioned that because part of why I felt motivated to put the energy into writing it once it had been accepted as a proposal was as a Marine, I had gotten very little exposure to Boyd, kind of growing up. I got MCDP 1 going into basic school like everybody does. And then as a pilot, yeah, we had the OODA loop was in some of our tactics briefs that we would get, but without real sort of any context or in very superficial explanation about like how this applied to us as pilots. And that was about it. And so part of the like why I initially did the research that resulted in the book was I didn't know any of the story. So I wanted to learn on my own because I knew that around the edges he'd obviously had a big impact on the Marine Corps at the time he was alive. And I wanted to figure out why that was because we simply didn't get that story. And I just found it a fascinating story of, both the impact of like one guy's ideas as well as how an institution can kind of like, change and reform itself. So I kind of wanted to write the story that like nobody told me so that, other Marines could read about it and get a
it was
better understanding.
Yeah, and it's going to relate to what we're going to talk to in a couple of minutes too, about your game, which I read the rules today, and I have to say I've seen you play it 3 or 4 times, and the table's always crowded. I can't get in there, so I'm just going to have to barge into your house and get Sebastian and I to play it with you because there's a lot of goodness there. And folks, for a recap, OODA loop: observe, orient, decide, and act. About decision making. And I recommend the book, and you can get it from MCU Press. But I think I got like 6 copies, and I signed "Thank you for reading my book, Ian Brown" to all of them. So I've been getting like $50 a copy. So I think I owe you a dinner. But we're here to talk about maneuver warfare, not the actual maneuver warfare, but the game. So I understand. I know that the game came about while you were at Krulak. So kind of explain what you did there, and then what was the bright light bulb that went off that became this game.
Yeah. So I started working on it while I was at the center, but to be clear, it was not a center product. And I actually, in watching, Sebastian, you mentioned his name a couple times, in watching his game development for his own game, and then talking to Tim Barrick, who's now the director of wargaming at MCU. They gave me a lot of very valuable lessons about sort of keeping the lanes of intellectual property clean, because they had learned some very hard lessons about that in their own game design. So I found it kind of ironic that, like, I did a ton of wargaming at the Krulak Center. I couldn't do anything with this game while I was there, even while I was building scenarios and custom pieces for Sebastian's game and playing other games with command and staff students and the enlisted folks that see me. I was very deliberate about not doing any work on the game there to make sure that we kept the streams, the lanes of the swimming lanes clear of who owned the game and where it was. But this is actually kind of my second attempt to make my own game. I had a first failed attempt in spring of 2021, and it was right after the Marine Corps doctrinal publication on competing came out. And I looked at it and I was like, hey, we have lots of games about war. Wouldn't it be great if there was a game about competing where you could go, I wanted to gamify the doctrine, essentially. And I bought a bunch of blank poker cards, and I tried to come up with a way that you could compete in a card game. And I couldn't figure out how to do it effectively. And then I had a lot of other stuff on my plate, so I just kind of put that away on the shelf, and it didn't go anywhere. However, about a year later, I revisited. I was really interested in making, after seeing especially the work Sebastian did, and trying to make a game for Marines that was accessible, timely, and relevant, but also required a minimal sort of equipment footprint. You didn't need to take up an entire room with it. You could put it on, as long as you had a flat surface and a light source, you could play Sebastian's game. And, he liked to talk about it kind of as an expeditionary thing. And that came literally true at one point, when there were some Marines in a reserve logistics unit, I think, who sent pictures to him of them playing his game, in a command tent when they were out in the field doing exercises.
Shouldn't they be doing something else that we're paying them for?
I'm sure that, hey, maybe that was part of their COA wargaming staff. I don't know.
Yeah. And the game we're talking about is Littoral Commander?
Yes, Littoral Commander. It was the prototype edition at that point. But that, I was like, that is it's fantastic, but also I wanted to sort of make something like that. And then I started thinking back to my failed attempt to make a card game, but then I looked a little further back in my own life. And you'd asked me initially, what is a game that I played a lot that kind of helped form me?
I thought you were getting out of answering that question. Okay.
Oh, no. I played a lot of games as a younger person, but the one that really informed the design of this card game was one that I played a lot, and I bought a lot of cards in, and it was the Star Wars customizable card game put out by the Decipher company in the mid to late 1990s. I bought every set. I still have thousands of those cards in my basement. And they did not quite accumulate the net worth that I'd hoped they would when I bought them at the time, but they look nice.
Honey, this is a great investment, I swear.
Yeah. It's a good thing my wife didn't know me back then. Lives could have had a different trajectory.
That's right.
But anyway, I remember back to then, and one of the things that I liked about that type of card game was everything you needed to play the entire game you could fit into a deck of 60 cards. And to me, that was the ultimate in sort of an expeditionary game that you could play almost anywhere, because you could fit the whole game in your pocket. And I also know from my own sort of personal, my deployment experiences, military experiences, Marines play card games almost wherever they are. I know Marines play Magic the Gathering, which is also, one of the most popular games that's out there. They're a top seller, and it's not even close. But Marines also like to play, card games with basic poker decks. They like to play spades and other things. So I'm like, Marines are playing card games. And some of them play the deck construction type game like Magic the Gathering. And I thought maybe there could be an appetite for a card game that you could put in your cargo pocket, right? But going back to my attempt to gamify Doctrine with the competing pub, which I failed, I was like, okay, well, let me try something that's a little, simpler to understand. Go back to the warfare part of being a warfighter, and try and gamify elements of maneuver warfare Doctrine. And so those were sort of my pillars. Was like making it I wanted it to be a small, compact game that you could put in your pocket. I wanted to try and gamify some Marine Corps doctrinal concepts, but I also wanted to gamify, things we were seeing in the real world, in battlefields on the real world today, and things that were emerging as potential challenges tomorrow. I wanted it to be, just like Sebastian's game. I wanted it to be relevant to the modern challenges that our Marines and the other Americans who wear the uniform would be facing. So that with that kind of in mind, I think I started making the prototypes in the summer of 2022 on the kitchen table of my parents' farmhouse up in Ottawa, Canada. While they were minding my kids, I was scribbling on these blank poker cards again and building out the prototype. And then I just started playtesting it after that. And you've seen, if anyone out there who's followed me on various social medias has seen pictures of the prototypes and the playtest, and the game has obviously evolved a lot since I drew stick figures on blank poker cards. And, but I was fortunate enough that I got an offer from Jim Dietz of the Dietz Foundation, who's published Sebastian's game, but who's also published games in an educational theme, which is kind of what I wanted to present it as. I wanted it to be a fun game, but I also wanted, my target audience of the military folks to be able to learn from it, and offered to publish it, and it's available for pre-order right now. So I'll stop there.
Oh yeah. No, we'll hit that because I think folks figure out we have folks on so they can buy stuff. Remember, our audience is a lot of middle-aged white guys with a lot of disposable income, and you know who I'm talking about. So a guy came up to me at Historicon saying, "I hate you," and I'm like, wow, you don't look like my ex-wife. And he goes, no, everything that you talk about in your podcast, I end up buying. And I'm like, yeah, well, I mean, I don't make you buy it, but it's kind of interesting. I'm going to take you back once again, sort of an inside joke. For Sebastian's last class, you played an interesting game that also had that playable mobility, as it were. The EOD game.
Oh yeah, I love that one. That was fantastic.
I'm actually get Savannah to come down to McWell and demo the game for us. And it's a game where you have to. It was designed for Marine Corps EOD, and I'll tell you what, that group did such a good job because they weren't EOD specialists. The sponsor wasn't that much of a gamer, and they did an amazing game. But the best thing is, if you complete your mission, what do you get?
What is it? Crayons, right?
You get crayons, and that's I think Sebastian's evilness coming out there, and he's a crayon eater too. And I'll tell you what, I kind of dig him now as well. But it's interesting that you looked at the means of gaming, portable, that folks could take with them. If you could play it in the back of a C-17, it's a pretty good game. And I've seen guys play Magic on C-17s. It's the wildest thing, when you're deploying somewhere. You guys spend a lot of time on boats, so yeah,
Yep.
You want to take a game with you. With that in mind, did that alter your design any, or did it make it easier?
So it presented some unique challenges, which I didn't feel like it made it harder, but I had to think through how I wanted to crack certain problems, because part of that, like that portability design philosophy, was I wanted my game to be one component, the cards. Just everything you need to play the game is in a card in some fashion, and so I guess one of the challenges became making sure I didn't explode the number of cards that were available in the game and ruin my own portability type thing. So I established some caps, like kind of they were sort of arbitrary, I guess, at the beginning. But as I was playtesting, I found no reason to change them. And I took them from other games like Magic the Gathering and Star Wars, which had, you know, 50 to 60 cards is everything you're allowed to bring in your deck. So I took 60 cards as, you know, that's what the players get to bring to the table maximum. You obviously have more cards available to you to build out what you want to put in your deck, but you know, you don't need to bring all those other cards with you, right? When you play the game, if you're, as you said, the back of a C-17, if you're on a boat, you got those 60 cards, and a set of terrain cards, then you can play the game, and that's all you need. So, and one of the challenges though was almost every game has some sort of, you know, random number generator, like a dice, or you know, in some of the card games, you have numbers that are affixed to the cards to sort of be your dice random number generators. And in the Star Wars card game, you had these numbers up in the top corner of one of the cards, which you would draw those as you needed to sort of adjudicate combat or various actions in the game. So the way I was designing it, I needed them. I needed numbers in some fashion because that was how I was going to resolve a lot of the combat actions and the card draws. But I also didn't like how the way the numbers were affixed to, you know, specific units and like capabilities of other cards in the game. Sometimes you would like put a useless card in your deck, right, just because it has a higher number to give you a higher probability of success. And I felt that sort of like skewed the whole purpose of deck construction. Because getting back to the military side, like we try and minimize our randomness in what we do. And I didn't want you to include some utterly useless capability in your deck that you didn't want at all, and you only had it because it had a certain number on it. So I separated the numbers from the rest of the things in the deck, and created, and so I created a separate set of cards that have your number generators. But then going back to that gamifying of the doctrine, I took the idea that war is a clash of wills, and I made that the literal objective of the game, where I try. I don't want to be, maybe it's presumptuous of me to try and quantify the inquantifiable, because everybody says that will is, you can't define it, right? It's intangible. Well, I made it tangible.
Will's the guy I work with.
Yeah, there you go. He's real enough, right?
Yeah. He's the one that's reading the Boyd book. So yeah, I guess he's real.
Hey, let's make copies of him so we can get more of those books out there. But yeah, so I decided that will was going to be the victory objective and the currency for action in the game. So I separated like the will as its own stack of cards away from all your sort of combat units, and I put the numbers, the dice numbers essentially on the cards. And so your willpower also kind of became your adjudicating mechanism. And I also tried to intertwine the amount of will you could bring with the amount of physical material you could bring, to sort of represent, if you want to be the person that simply throws metal at the opponent and hopes that they're overwhelmed, you can do that, but you might be sacrificing some other capabilities you might want. So the way that part of the deck construction strategy works is you can decide to reduce the amount of will you include in your 60 cards to bring more stuff. However, it makes it easier for your opponent to destroy all of your will and win the game. So, you kind of decide how you want to do that.
Once again, Zane, I haven't played it yet, but I thought that was really interesting. And it's, you talk about all games involve decision making, but games where you sit there and deck building games are amazing at this, is that your head's in the game before you even meet an opponent to play, because you're building your deck. And it's so interesting when I watch guys build decks or girls build decks for games, because almost everything in your deck. You do not know what your opponent's deck is going to be. And then how do you adapt what you planned for when it comes up against an opponent. Kind of like
That's
how
like
real war
warfare.
works.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I mean, like to me, the deck construction mechanic of a game was, I saw it simply as a microcosm of military planning, and it's certainly a microcosm of whether what you put together in a Marine Expeditionary Unit or any unit or task force you send overseas. Like, you get to decide the stuff you bring, but you can't bring everything, and you don't know what your opponent's going to do to you, so you have to hedge in a little bit, and you're going to take some risk in some places if you don't bring the right stuff, and that's all part of the deck construction strategy. And again, and part of like how I wanted to make the game relevant to the military audience was making them plan and think about that, and not just throw random crap inside their deck because it looks cool. No, you have to think about, what is your bid for victory in your deck? Is your bid for victory going to be on land, air, sea, in the information realm? And you have to bring, the capabilities that will, give you greater advantages there. But in doing so, you're also sacrificing potential advantages in other domains. But that's life. That's life in the game world, and that's life in, military planning. You can't bring everything and do everything all the time. You have to make choices. And so that's to me, I thought the deck construction game was a great way to capture something in the military you're doing already when you plan.
It really is. And if you guys haven't picked this up, Ian is a huge Star Wars game player, and I would assume fan. I'm sure you love all the movies as the rest of us do. And it's one of the interesting things, like if you go on any of the X-Wing forums back in the day, it was, and they were like, those list and force builders for X-Wing. This one will always win. And I laughed because, yeah, you know everything, but you don't know what you're going to play against. And then how do you make that list you build fungible from multiple threats? And, you know, uh, as we know in, with the TLTs, how do you overcome that? How do you overcome a list that's arc dodging, right? With the little Sunterfell there. And
Yeah.
sometimes gamers don't get that, and they don't realize how, and this is really big in miniatures gaming, especially with tournament type games. Guys will sit there and create these lists. You don't have enemy Kophams. You don't know what you're going to play against, nor do you have the time to play against every conceivable type of threat that you're going to see. But what will set you up to be both fungible, agile, and be able to play a series of cards that will win the game just from reading it. And like I said, I do want to play this. I really felt that was, gamers will do this naturally that buy this game. They don't realize how important it is and how applicable it is to military thinking. And that's what I thought was like, wow, that's pretty smart. Um, how long did that take, or was this bam, when you got your inspiration, you kind of knew that, I'm going to mess with you on multiple domains, because the game plays, it's a multi-domain game: land, air, sea, cyber,
In space.
space, and space. And how do you get them to understand that you're not going to win everywhere? And once again, as you start playing the game, you don't know what's going to happen next. How do you react? And I love the fact that the decision making for this game starts as soon as you get your cards, as soon as they arrive at your house, because you're constantly thinking and reacting. I thought that was pretty ingenious. Let's talk about some of the things that do play in the game. Now we know there's will. You have a lot of stuff in each of the domains. And if you could go through that, and then the question is, why'd you put Sebastian on a card? For the love of God.
He's not the only one who's got a little Easter egg in there. There's a couple others I'm talking about.
If you see a fat, ugly guy, it's not me in the card deck. I just want to tell you. Just saying.
Oh, no, hey, I take applications. If you want to be in there, I can find a way.
As long as I get to wear my horse head mask, but please go ahead.
Yeah, there might be a way to do that.
Yeah.
But back to your earlier question about like when did I try and build this into the game? I think I I decided on some of the parameters fairly early on, along with like the deck size, the idea that you had to think hard about how you were going to build your deck before you walk to the table. Because again, I wanted to make it relevant, to the military audience, because we don't just like. Maybe some days it does seem like we just like randomly pull stuff out of the air, right, and throw it together and close our eyes and pray that it works. But like that's not how it's supposed to work. Like you always have a plan, right? Like you have a plan of force flow going into a theater. You have a plan for what assets you want first, what you want on day 15, what you want on day 30, and so on. And so I wanted to pretty early on, I wanted to incorporate that in the game design to have players think about that. But back to the multi-domain aspect, I'm not a huge fan of the phrase multi-domain operations and such, but since that's the common currency, that's kind of how I approach the design of the battlefield, and it just so happens that it correlates with land, air, sea, space, and information.
Well, this podcast is an hour. By the time we get finished, or maybe a little more than an hour, they'll have changed JADC2, CC. They'll change it by the end. So you may have to change the game because we've changed it quite a bit in the last few years. But I didn't. Please go ahead.
Yeah, well, for the purposes of this game, I think we're sticking with those at least through the first print edition. But for that interlocking aspect, though, so apart from the uncertainty of not knowing what your opponent brings to the table, you don't always know where you're going to fight. Although you will try and fight in places that you have an advantage in, and so that kind of fed into how I crafted the terrain layout. Because of the increasing focus on the space and information domains, I made those a permanent part of every game that you play. Those will always be on the table. So you have to plan for them to be there and have effects there. You can choose not to put anything in space or information and just completely cede those to your opponent. That's a choice in your deck construction. Probably not a wise idea though, because the no two battlefields in the game will look the same, but there will always be the information and the space domains. So you can at least plan to that. But with that, I gave the players sort of it's a semi-randomized terrain laydown to build out the battlefield. So as you said, I've got the will cards. I've got the call them the maneuver cards, which are like your physical things you can deploy on the battlefield. And then you have your domain cards, which are a separate set that you do it's a modular terrain thing, if you will, from the gaming world. And so there's a bunch of different cards that represents land, sea, in addition to space and information, and then sort of in invisible layers, airspace is always a permanent domain over all the terrestrial domains. And then on all of the maritime domains, there's always a subsurface aspect to it. I didn't make cards for those just to kind of keep the card creep from taking over the table, but they always exist. But when you set up your battlefield, you get to pick a few of those cards yourself, based on how you've built your deck, what you've optimized it for, whether it's air, land, sea, or what have you. Your opponent gets to do that as well, but then you draw a bunch of random terrain cards and insert them into the ones that you've already laid down to really generate unexpected places where conflict might occur. And then on top of that, I have there's an extra set of cards that go on top of all the domains, which I've called domain variable cards. Doesn't really easily roll off the tongue, but it's essentially a set of random. A lot of them are environmental factors, such as floods, fires, thunderstorms that are going to affect your ability to fly through a certain place. Some of them are.
You mean stuff like climate change?
So
in some respects.
I haven't done something specifically in that range. I considered that after I designed a bunch of them, and I decided to not do something it's on the shelf maybe for a future set if this one goes well and there's call for it. But not specifically related to climate change, but definitely related to environmental factors that can happen on a battlefield that you can't control, right? Like if as a pilot, I know like I can have the best mission plan in the world. If there's a raging thunderstorm over my airfield all day, I'm not doing that mission. And the rest of the elements that are out there, they got to figure out something else to do, some other way to accomplish the mission, because I can't fly. And but we can't say that we're not going to go do our other missions. You have to adapt to those variables that come out there. Some of the variables are also human related. So I have a couple that represent internally displaced persons in a combat area. So it makes it harder to move through those spaces. There are extra penalties if you fight in those places, but they can also give you a benefit in terms of your willpower, because it gives you an opportunity to conduct humanitarian aid, which is a key mechanic in the game for managing your flow of will, like either recovering will that you've lost or helping to drain it from your opponent. By doing humanitarian aid as part of like kind of a larger, narrative messaging campaign that you're here to help and the other guy's not. And then on top of that, there are some variables which they basically become like key terrain on the battlefield, and those can become flashpoints that both players will fight over, because control of them will allow you to again drain your opponent's will more quickly if you control these key terrain pieces. And maybe it's a little abstract in making them completely randomized, but I also think it's fair to say that there are pieces of battlefields, in past history that assume an importance well beyond any strategic measure they give you, right? Like you keep fighting for them because you fought for them and you've lost a lot of guys and you don't want the sacrifice of all those troops to be in vain. So you keep fighting for this place, this hill, this town that has, maybe from a higher level has little strategic value, but it assumes a huge amount of, emotional value, right? Intangible value, will value even. So
case in point.
Yeah, Khe-Sanh, you could look at we could even fast forward to the war in Ukraine now, right? That there was a lot of questions about
Adavika and
Adavika
Bakhmut.
and Bakhmut, that was a big one, right? Like both sides invested huge resources into it. And, those of us who are doing the Monday morning quarterbacking are saying like, that, for the Russians, if they take that city, okay, great. There's like 3 more cities beyond that, right? Like that gains them very little. And, on the Ukrainian side, like it's investing a huge amount of the limited resources they have to keep it, where those resources have been used elsewhere. But, the end of the day, it was like they decided that was an important place to fight for. And so it became an important place to fight for. And so that's kind of what I tried to do with those random objective cards, because, an empty piece of ocean or a random hill out there can become something that historians write about decades later because of what happened there. And you're like, why did this matter at the time? It just happens. It's part of the nature of war. So I put it in there.
Verdun, Stalingrad. I mean, Verdun had something, in the psyche of the French. They couldn't lose it. You didn't know those forts were totally demilled by that time and not within a strategic plan. And the Germans knew that. And that's why they attacked there. You look at Stalingrad. Why was that so important? Well, it was named after Stalin for one reason. There's a lot of reasons why we fight over certain terrain. And you look at some battles in history. Whenever I play any of the many games I have about Gettysburg, right? Terrain dictates where that battle was fought. But if you take it up a notch, that had to be fought at Gettysburg to stop the South. It's funny how geography plays such a mean trick in military history. We would never have heard of half these places that battles have been fought. like Waterloo. Heck, the battle wasn't even fought at Waterloo. It's interesting how you've incorporated into your game, and you do it rather slickly, if that's a word. I don't think it is.
I'll say it's a word.
It's the beautiful thing when I watch folks play test games is they don't realize how much they're learning. They just really want to compete. And it's funny from just once again reading through these rules, there's a lot there that's very applicable. Now, do you have to be a former Marine, a strategist to play and enjoy this game? I don't think so. And while that could have been one of the underlying reasons why you wrote this, the game looks like it's a hell of a lot of fun. And if you're not careful, you may learn a couple things.
Yeah, well, I definitely had, Marines on the mind when I was, initially designing this. Like I said, I was trying to gamify certain parts of Marine doctrine, very specific Marine doctrine. It's called maneuver warfare for a reason. And going back to like what did I initially decide to put into the two sides? There's a red side and a blue side. I haven't named them anything beyond red and blue, and I'm not sure that I will at this point. But the blue side looks very much like a Marine Air Ground Task Force with some Navy help, and that was on purpose. Now, in the future, I again, if there's any modicum of success with this in the future, I plan to expand. In fact, I've got a bunch of my little stick figure drawings. My next set of cards, if there is a next set, I have other things I want to put in there to expand it out to better capture different capabilities from the other services. But for now, my starting point was the Marine Corps because that's what I know and love, and
write what you know, man. Write what you know.
Yeah. But to your point though, I didn't want to limit it to only Marine stuff. So while certain game terms, if you're a Marine, you'll recognize some of them pretty clearly. I didn't want to make it inaccessible to a larger public. And in fact, a lot of the most valuable playtesting I did was with very, very specifically non-Marine audiences. I did a tremendous amount of playtesting with the Break My Game organization.
Yeah, they're good guys.
I took they actually, how did this work? I think I forget if I had done a session before with them, but they invited, or I registered through them for a table at AwesomeCon last summer up in DC, to play test just with, the audience that comes through AwesomeCon. And then I did a number of other play tests with the Break My Game folks up in Manassas at the Tabletop Cafe. No, the Crossroads Cafe. Yeah.
I got to mention my friend John's place all the time. It's an awesome place.
Yeah, and the demographic there, like several of the play testers were kids, kids who were teenagers, like my eldest, who's been one of my main play testers, But I also, as you saw, I took it up to Georgetown, and that's kind of a different demographic. But the point is, like, those were all non-military audiences, and I really wanted to put it in front of those to see if it was something accessible and enjoyable to people who, maybe they'd heard the name Marine Corps, on a freaking podcast somewhere else, and that's it. I didn't want to make it inaccessible if you weren't part of the club. And so I think that based on the feedback I've gotten from them, that I was successful in that. So that if you're a Marine, like, great, there's a lot of inside jokes, and a lot of terms that'll be very recognizable to you. And, you'll understand the structure of the blue deck, especially, why the cards that are in there that there are. But if you're not, you can still play this, and it's still a deck construction game about warfare. And you don't need to have any special knowledge to come in and play it.
Social media is kind of funny. And also, it's a huge source of entertainment for me. And I am on so many of these modern warfare Facebook groups. And I love how these guys talk about this game's realistic. And I know if you were to see it too, you'd have to laugh. And I keep telling them, well, no game's realistic. And I don't, you remember, like, what was it last summer? Jim Lacey got upset with me. I'm like, yeah, it's realistic. I mean, but so's a time machine. The second I move or make a move in a game, it's no longer historical. Like, we play these games for that reason. And when, inviting folks, so, Jason Matthews that did Twilight Struggle, an amazing game. I invited him
Yeah.
up to the game at MCU last week. And I just thought he'd hang out for 2 hours, but he was hanging out with Matt and Tim. And I had to drag him out of there. I had hockey tickets that night. And he loved it. And he goes, it's so interesting, like how the games, the way they played it, it's subtle, but they learn a lesson from that. I said, right, because that's how you validate learning. It's you don't need a 5,000 page rule book to make your game somewhat authentic. It's whether or not you're abstracting the important stuff the right way. Oak and Iron, which I know you guys have played.
Yep.
People that sail say best model of ships of sail of any game ever, because the guy that did the game owns a sailboat, loves that stuff, did it right. And if you look at the easy game to play, but the way it's abstracted, you don't need to play a, wooden ships, iron men, Sea Creek type 10,000 rules. It's there, it's simple, and great game designers know how to abstract. And from reading through the rules, I think you've kind of hit that one out of the park. Was that difficult to do? Is to demarinify the game enough where anybody can kind of understand a little bit more about joint warfare in multiple domains? Because
So
it could not have been easy.
yeah, well, again, I drew a lot of inspiration from my past, deck construction, card playing things, and part of the limit I imposed on myself was a physical constraint on just how big this game could be, and that comes down, to the size of the boxes the cards come in, and I have memories of earlier deck construction games back in my younger days, like if you could fit the rules into the box in the card game, like that's the level of complexity you're allowed to have, right? You've got like maybe 3 or 4 millimeters of thickness of rules. The rest of it has to be the cards. Otherwise, people are going to open the box and be like, "I've thought I bought a card game, right? Not a library book with a couple of cards to come with it."
Yeah.
So I put that like along with the size of the decks, the 60 cards, and trying to keep myself from constantly inventing new cards just because I thought it was cool. I from the outset, I think I'm justified in saying I put constraints on myself to keep it, accessible in the way that a good deck construction game is accessible. When it came to like the demarinifying stuff, I think maybe I initially had tried really hard to put a Marine Corps, term or doctrinal phrase in at every single point. And I think I relatively quickly got to the point where I'm like, if I do that, I will make it inaccessible and uninteresting to others. So I sort of pulled more of that stuff into the background in terms of some of the different categories of cards, what I called them. It's funny. I can't use certain specific Marine Corps type names and terms because, as I've learned, some of those are trademarked. So you will not actually find the term Marine in any of my cards, just as with Sebastian's game. They're maritime infantry or naval infantry. They're not Marines for reasons. But
Which is funny. It's okay. I'll just say it. The only people that have trademarked anything, and it's the Marine Corps Association, I think, that has it trademarked. Because if I want to tomorrow morning, I can make 10,000 101st Airborne patches and sell them and make money off them. But
it's an unpleasant fight. I know Sebastian had, and he had a lot of unpleasant surprises in the course of that. I learned by watching what he was going through. I learned a lot about what to not put into the game to make sure I didn't have to go through that. So that definitely helped in the game design process.
I remember he had me look at the stuff Jim sent over, and I go, "What about legal?" And he goes, "What would I need that for?" And 48 hours later, he got that cease and desist. And I'm like, you listen, you can ignore me at your own risk, dude. But yeah, it's in a way it doesn't. I don't think it takes away anything from the game. And even like with Littoral Commander, some of the cards use more joint terms, dude. Use more joint terms, or just try this. Use English,
Yeah.
because
Yeah.
it's we understand what this stuff does, but everybody thinks HIMARS is a missile
Yeah. So
in games.
yeah, so I say, partly from, the hard lessons that I watched Sebastian learn, and I was on the receiving end of a number of heated rants from him about that. Interestingly, going back to like the book editing process for my boy book, my editor was fantastic in making me stop talking like a Marine and talk like a normal human being, so that the book itself could be better understood by a wider audience. So I tried to apply that, uh, where I could, to have terms that would be recognizable to the military audience, but also recognizable to a casual person just picking it up and trying to figure out what the different things do, right? So, like, to the HIMARS point, there's no HIMARS in my game. You have you have mobile rocket artillery, and that covers the capability, but you can also look at it and you can understand the words in the title, and then the picture on the card will also show you what it is. I'm trying. I can't honestly think of any specific card except for maybe one where I do call it a maneuver warfare mindset. That's like direct, pulling from a Marine Corps specific term. But almost all of the other cards I have out there, like if it's a Navy missile cruiser, I just call it a missile cruiser. It's not an Aegis class destroyer or whatever. It's a missile cruiser. A tank is a tank. A mechanized infantry is mechanized infantry. And
It's common language.
Yeah, it's common language. When it came to the some of the stuff for like the information operations you can do, I had I tried to avoid overly technical terms, but I think I tried to use at least what I think are common terms of the trade, because like there are some things in the cyber information realm that they just have like one name and that's it, right? There's no synonym that you can use. um, you know, but I think term like I have a card that does deepfakes, right? I think that's a fairly commonly understood term these days.
Yeah.
Or the honeypot, right? That's a tried and true espionage technique that should be recognizable to anybody who kind of knows
That
anything about spycraft.
that has historically worked on Marines.
Yeah, I mean, if you're looking at the headlines these days, it's still working on people in the military.
Yeah. I
Who should know
I
better?
think I wish I got honeypotted at one time. Never really happened. Once again, funny aside story. So a lot of folks say, I want you to look at my game design, and they don't have a military background. And what they do is they end up jamming that stuff in there. And I go, what does this mean to you? No, that's not really what it is. One recently I got, it was a HIMARS missile. And I had a picture of a truck flying through the air. I go, that's a HIMARS missile. Not understanding. So
Yeah.
yeah, it's HIMARS is the name of the truck. It shoots a missile, but then again, I realize that not every branch looks at it that way, because I had an army guy saying HIMARS missile. I go, okay, dude,
He should know better.
yet you should know better. And I go, if you tell me you're in artillery, I swear to you, I'm going to strangle you. Well, I misspoke, but that's what everybody says. I go, that's right. Well, don't be stupid like everybody else. Here, eat a crayon, soldier. But yeah, there's a lot of like nuanced things in this game that I found very interesting. The other one is it's the blend of all of these different capabilities of how it brings you success on the battlefield. Most of the times, we just think it's force on force. The folks with the more firepower will always win. And that is just now how it works. And
Yeah,
I
and that's
I dig
sorry.
that. No, go ahead.
Well, yeah, and that's something that was a design approach I took because I was trying to gamify the will aspect of conflict, but I didn't simply want that to turn out into like yet another Panzer Blitz or missile firing fast back and forth. And so I wanted to give the players a lot of options on how they could attack their opponent's will without blowing stuff up. Although blowing stuff up is still necessary, and it is a great way to degrade your opponent's will.
Right.
But I guess but part of my approach, like trying to get them to think beyond just the stuff and focus on the will, is the combat units in the game. Um, when they're destroyed, they don't go out of the game entirely. They go back to the bottom of your deck to to kind of be reconstituted and re-put together. They can appear later in the game. And in fact, if you're, I, I don't think a game has ever gone so long that you cycle through all the cards in your deck multiple times. But if you were to get into a longer fight and you're managing your loss and your reconstitution of will effectively, you could be reconstituting units you've lost repeatedly, which it's forced regeneration is a thing in warfare, right? Like just
Yeah.
because you've lost a tank battalion doesn't mean you never get another tank battalion back, right? But you do. It takes time to regenerate it. So if you lose your maritime infantry tank battalion in my game, you can reconstitute it later on. It will reappear, but it's going to take time to pop back up through your deck. But back to the willpower thing. Outside of just slinging missiles at each other, there are different ways to attack your opponent's will, and I wanted to include lots of options for that and make them attractive to the players as a more multi-pronged approach to going after your opponent's will. And so that's why I talked about the humanitarian aid. That's originally I incorporated that because one of my early playtesters pointed out an uncomfortable fact, which was like it's pretty easy. Like you can smack down your opponent's will just by fighting. You can get it down to like 2 or 3 cards, right? But then your opponent has absolutely no incentive to stay and fight to lose those last couple. They could run around the board and just try and exhaust you. So I was like, all right, how do you get rid of those last couple of cards so we can end this game, without it going for 4 hours? Excuse me.
If you ever do a strategic game, I think you have the mechanics there because loss of will is a logical off ramp to stop fighting. And usually you look for off ramps in deterrence, but armies stop fighting for a reason. There's a political aspect of it, which once again, slickly, that you throw in the game. It's especially in modern warfare. World War II ended in Europe because we captured all of Germany. In Japan, it was more a loss of will, and both are important. You look at Iraq 2003. Well, we're sitting here in your country, you've lost. But as we've seen, especially in very modern irregular warfare, if the enemy still has will, they'll keep fighting. And when you lose your will, I think it's game over because to me, the will in your game is not just it's stuff that weighs on senior leaders of when to stop fighting, whether it's political considerations, world considerations, and you just use will. And I think it encapsulates so much that I'm like, this is an interesting take.
Yeah,
I thought it was interesting.
yeah. There's a definite there's a definite ebb and flow of gameplay based on how much will you have, and part of what I was hoping to represent to the players when you have lost will, when like in the game when you've got fewer cards, that restricts your freedom of action, and you have to start shifting from just doing all kinds of trying to just be frenetic on the battlefield. Now you really have to think about preserving what little will you have left and then how you can regenerate it while still trying to keep your opponent from, being able to sort of catch a breather while you're on your back foot and be even stronger once you've sort of reconstituted yourself. And so that's why I wanted different ways to both, lose will for your opponent and regain it for yourself. The humanitarian aid was one way of doing that. Like I said, it was partly a way to just kind of get to the end game. But I also felt that it's part of that strategic narrative on the battlefield, especially for the United States, where when we do humanitarian aid, we have a narrative strategy where we want it to be visible. We don't only want to do it, we want to be seen doing it, because that has a willpower effect on us, on the people who were there to help, and then the people who are trying to potentially undercut us. If we're the ones giving out food and setting up shelters and it's not our adversary, that helps us win in the information campaign. And then speaking of the information campaign, I wanted that environment to be very, very active, which is why I made it a permanent part of every game board, so that if you ignore the information domain, man, your opponent can get away with some really, really damaging stuff against you. And it's not just the use of, cyber, the ones and the zeros kind of thing, but I have cards in the information domain where if you, if you cause a loss of will to your opponent in a conflict, hey, you could use something very similar to a Marine information group, and you blast out that victory that you just had, and that causes your opponent to lose more will, because not only did they lose that fight, you have shown them losing that fight, which can be quite demoralizing to the other people on the other side there. And yeah, so I like, if you simply build a deck where all you have is firepower, you'll be able to destroy a lot of things, but you won't have all of the other, pieces of the puzzle outside of just the tanks and the jets and the ships that are necessary for you to stay in a fight for a long time, to win that struggle of wills, which is, as history has shown, like, it's never over as fast as you think it is. It becomes a battle of, not just like it's a battle of treasure, a battle of resources, but it's also, do you have the willpower to stick around and fight it out until the end? And that will aspect is more than just how many tanks, how many planes you have. So I wanted different vectors in the game to represent that you have to include that in your strategy.
Yeah, I from reading your books, from talking to you for the last few years, I knew how hard you worked on this game. I'm like, it's just from reading the rules today, and actually started them last night because I read them a few times, that it's so much is under the hood of this game that I think folks will love this game. And you know what I realized? I didn't back the game yet. So as we're talking, I'm doing it now.
Well, no time
Because,
like the present.
yeah. And look, if you've listened this far in this podcast and you don't get this damn game, you're gonna wish you have, because I think that this is a unique take on gaming in itself. I think we should have more mobile games, as it were, deck building games, especially in the military arena. I think folks have tried this before. Well, if they have, it must have failed, because I haven't seen anything like this. And taking, you made an interesting comment. This was a side project aside from what you were doing at Krulak. And every game project I've worked on has DNA from every game I've ever played my entire life. It doesn't mean that this has to go in this game. Sometimes this should never go in any game at any time. But it's interesting too when you meet a lot of designers that have some amazing games. The game, much like a book, it's almost like their autobiography, because every little thing about them and their gaming experience and their design philosophy is put into this product. And I think in this case, it's there because you're covering stuff, stuff that you're passionate about. And you do it in a way where there's so much decision making in this game. And even the reconstitution, I did not pick that up, knowing recovery and reconstitution of units, especially in combat zones, it takes a while. So, how do you play that in your game? You put it underneath the deck. You may or may not get to it later. And I didn't even pick that up. It's probably because I'm not all that bright sometimes. But all these little things, and there's a lot more we could talk about on that. I
Oh yeah.
dig how this thing works because there's nothing in there that's a lot of guys overbake games, and you know what I'm talking about. There's some games that are just way overbaked. At some point, they didn't stop. But in this game, everything's there for a very specific purpose. And the finesse of this game, covering such a brutal subject matter, is once again something that I was taken aback with. Um, Last week, one of the good parts about our day jobs, man, is we get to play games at work sometimes, and we played Nineveh.
Oh yeah.
Um,
I played that, but I
yeah,
want to.
you haven't played it. Let me tell you something. Um, not to do shameless plug, review is coming out in a week or two for that. There's so much under the hood of that game that they have about building your capabilities for this fight. And as soon as I got finished with it, well, I would have planned better and I might have done better. I wanted to play it again right away. And it's a fun nail biting game. It's on my desk at work. Stop by any time. You know where I am.
Yeah.
And we'll play it. It's how it's there. And, when I wrote the article, I'm like, this is what good designers do with 14 pages of rules. The game is easy and fun to play and pick up, but there's so much of that under the hood finesse that I know is not easy to do. And I think folks, when they play this game, and they will buy it, it's $30, folks, man. Pick it up. I was thinking
Yeah, that's a deal.
it it really is. And this is a game that I always throw a card game in my game bag when I go to a con. And it's usually something like, the Duke of Nukes. It's more of a light game, but this is something that it's a real war game. Don't be fooled by the cards, folks. And if you're not careful, I think you'll learn a little bit about how certain enablers and capability, how it all works together. It's almost like you get to go to General Command and Staff and War College at the same time because that's in this game. And even if you've never gone to those schools, you get to see the difficulties of modern warfare. To quote our last chairman, this modern warfare stuff, it's pretty hard. Um, it is. But then to take it and gamify it, where I have a deck of cards and I can actually sit and tell you how to line up these effects and where to put your, Schwerpunkt, as it were. I think it does it brilliantly. Now I really want to play the damn game, so I'm gonna have to figure out how to play it. But I know you're going to be on the 19th, so
Yeah, I will be there with that game specifically.
yeah, and so I've seen you do it at Connections, running the games, and you just can't get to the table. And I've never everybody that's played it said it's pretty good. And from reading the rules, I can see it is pretty good. Um, I mean, the rule book, we're looking at what, 32 pages, but I know this is a draft. um, but it explains it. I don't think the game's overly difficult to play, and I just dig how you kind of do certain things in this game. So, is
Yeah,
there
and
is it? Yeah,
yeah, to the potential customers looking at it, the out of those 32 pages, a good 10 of them are just random lists of like starter decks that I had put together based on different playtesting options to kind of give my playtesters some ideas about, if you have no idea what to build initially, I'll give you some options, and those will at least not in the voluminous amount. I have them in my playtest rules. There's not going to be 10 pages of starter decks in there. So the slimming down the rules is going to be one of the things I'm going to be focusing on as we finalize the game here for production.
Yeah. Okay. So I hit go on the order. I thought I did it already, and maybe I didn't do a good email search, so I may have 2 copies coming. So that means if you catch me at a con and you could beat me at the game, you'll get one of the copies. If I've got 2 copies, so now I got to go buy an extra copy because someone's going to call me that I'm full of shit or cheap. But we always ask for spoilers. What's kind of brewing around in your head of a topic you want to do next?
Well, for this game specifically, like I said, I have expanded other service capabilities drawn on my little stick figure draft cards that I would like to include to have more, more Army, more Air Force, more Navy capabilities in there for your Joint Force stuff. But honestly, I've been thinking really hard about if there is like an expansion or a volume 2 to this thing. I'm going to put in some sort of like insurgent/terrorist group as like a third faction that you can play. And they're going to have all kinds of nasty asymmetric stuff outside of what red and blue have that you're going to have to deal with. And the human being inside of me, I hate, I hate the things I see on the news and on my social media feeds, of horrible things going on around the world. But I'm no longer strictly military professional. I'm civilian now, but I still do stuff for the military. But from that aspect, the professional look at military challenges and the professional look at what wargaming can help you understand about them is, I feel compelled to include those things in the game because you might have to deal with that nasty, ugly stuff at some point. And I to the realism point you talked about before, like I have no illusions. Like my game does not replicate combat, right? Like I abstract a ton of stuff in here to make it a playable game and not not something that takes up the entire room. But I also want the players to think about these things that they're seeing in the real world and that they might have to deal with. And in fact, I looking at what what's going on with the Houthis in the Red Sea and Hamas in Gaza and any number of other irregular groups. I think there's a lot of material there that could be put in and present a very challenging and different dynamic gameplay to players. But I was already doing that with this game here with the war in Ukraine. Like there were days where like I'd see something new on a headline, like either some weapon or some tactic or something that I was not familiar with, and I turn it into a card because I think it's part of the value of the game is putting relevant and timely things in your hands so that you can think about them even in an abstracted fashion. And that's why I have on the blue side I have one of my enablers, these attachment cards that you can attach to your larger units. There's a tank towing team, which is a tractor towing a tank, because we saw that in Ukraine with all these abandoned Russian vehicles that the Ukrainians had, the farmers tow them and then they repurposed and pointed back in the other direction, on the battlefield. I don't know if you remember, I think it was earlier this year, but there was some like Russian social media, one of the war bloggers that are popular over there. He got blown up by a trophy of himself in a bar.
I remember that. Yeah.
Yeah. So that's a card in the game too. Because there are, going back to why is Sebastian in the game? He's in there as a social media influencer.
Really?
Oh yeah. Yeah. Maybe that's not like the role he dreamed of, but he has an impact in the social media realm in terms of, the wargaming community that exists there. So, So I put him in there as a card. So he can have an impact in the information space, but then I've also made these other cards where, your sort of civilian type units on the thing, you can't drop a bomb, right, on a civilian unit. You just can't. However, I have given people capabilities where you can operate in that gray zone, those sort of dirty tricks aspects of it, and you can remove a problematic civilian unit off the game board with those capabilities. And I don't take like any sort of like gleeful, gruesome pleasure in it, but the fact is that stuff is out there, right?
Oh yeah.
You like the impact of the Russian mill bloggers on Russian opinion on the conduct of the war has been very real. They're not on the battlefield, but they are shaping and influencing Russian opinion, and that makes them an element of a conflict that you have to think about. So, what if you have a way to impact the bloggers, right? Shape the perspective of them, or make them a little more, maybe look over their shoulder a little bit harder for what they're writing. It's a simple fact of life, and I want the game to reflect those things that, especially the military person doesn't always think about these things as being part of the fight they have to fight, but they are. So they're in the
Yeah.
game, and if I do an expansion on it, it's going to be an insurgent, irregular group, quasi-terrorist organization, and I'm not going to not include things in the game simply because they might make some people feel uncomfortable.
Well, I mean, while we play these games for fun, and most of this audience does, war is I mean, you and I know it's a grotesque thing, and bad things happen to bad and good people in it, and we can't uninvent the firebombing of Tokyo. We can't uninvent, Srebrenica. These things happen, and they affected those conflicts to a great deal. And I think a game that can show you how they do affect the fight, because people don't think about, how would something like this affect the fight? Yeah, you can do linkages between each of those events and how they led to the culmination of a war or a conflict. There's so many things that affect the modern battlefield that, yes, some of them are horrible things, but that's the business we're in. And, a lot of gamers, it's kind of interesting because if you didn't have your background that you have or mine, you wouldn't think twice about putting that in a game. You'd put it in. And it's interesting that you say that. You're right. These are horrible things. They happen. And sometimes you don't know how that affects what's the butterfly effect of one mistake, one hitting a Chinese embassy in Belgrade.
Yeah. Yeah, I
What
remember that.
happens? Yeah. Yeah. I remember running down the hallway praying I didn't plan that mission, by the way. It's another story I have to tell you. But these things affect the fight, and even down to the fire team level of why we're fighting. It's there's an environment out there, and people are like, well, what's in the environment? Well, it's easy to go the other way. What isn't? And some of these things, I think the way that you put how some of even just how you explained it, these little things, what's the kill chain that will lead to affect my fight? To me, that's something interesting and exciting. So you got to design that game next week. I'm already signed up to be a play tester. Thanks.
Oh, great.
Yeah, I mean
Yeah, I'll get right on that.
yeah. I mean, I want to play this game tomorrow. So or yesterday, but it's I think this game gets at that, and but the only thing I just can't fathom is how you stopped at the 60 cards, but you had to stop eventually. It'd be the world's biggest deck of cards.
Yeah. Well, I going back to that initial, like, playing in the well deck of a ship or in the back of a plane. I in a lot of projects I do, like especially my writing projects, I will like, I'll vomit a word salad on the page, and then I'm spending all this time like culling it back to make it fit within the parameters. I think this game is actually the exception to how I usually do things, which is I established that 60 card cap very early on, and I never changed it. There may have been one or two occasions where I was like, what if we go into 65 or so? But I kept telling myself like that is a hard cap, and there are good reasons for it, because that is part of what makes the game the portable, the expeditionary, the low overhead thing that you can literally take anywhere. And if I violate that, then I may as well stop, because that's one of the selling points of the game that I'm trying to get across is you can put it in your pocket. And if I made it 120 cards, you can't put it in your pocket anymore. So,
in college, I had these big ass pants. I think that they were like the old OD, like almost Vietnam era, uniform pants, and I could stick a 6-pack in it, and it's a good thing, right? Or else I would have been an alcoholic. So at some point you have to stop, and that must have been the hardest thing to do, of saying, I don't want to add this, and just keeping it to that. I know that's difficult because I can't tell you how many folks just overbake the crap out of their games, and it just becomes somewhat unplayable. But it seems like you got a good design process and some self-discipline. Two things I lack, so I have to admire what I do not have. But it is I'm gonna hit the website. It is I just had it up because I bought the game today. But if you go to Dietz Foundation, I think it's
.org.
dietzfoundation.org. Pick up the game. And I know Sebastian's going to go, well, they could also pick up Littoral Commander Baltic. Well, yeah, you could, but this one's going to come out. Do you know when it's going to be sent off to the general public?
Yeah, it's going to depend on how quickly we can get through the funding campaign and then finalize the final card layout and design, all that stuff. I think Jim's target was we wanted it out by the back half of this year, and that's really going to depend on how quickly we can hit the funding mark. Because as soon as we hit that, then we're off to the races.
Yeah. So one of the things people are like, why do you write about certain things, certain games that aren't that popular? And I'm like, you're an idiot, because I want them to be popular because I want to play them. So I want to get this game by the end of the year in my hands. So buy bunches of copies, and most certainly, like I said, based on what I've seen and the reaction of people playing it, you got to pick this thing up. Despite the fact it's a card game, and if it, Wargamers doesn't have dice, they don't want to play it. Yeah, check this game out. Like I said, and at the price, it's it's a great stocking stuffer, because if it could fit in a pocket, it could fit in a sock.
Oh, it absolutely could. And I would love for it to be out, before Christmas at the end of this year, but it may well be that it's around Christmas when it's finally getting shipped out. So yeah, think of it as a stocking stuffer, because I've got my playtest kit right here that I'm staring at. It's 3 different little kind of plastic playing card boxes, but I could easily shove the entire game into a stocking and have room left over for lots of candy canes and Reese's Pieces and other stuff.
Yeah, I thought of stealing it not too long ago, by the way.
Well, I'm glad you didn't, because I only have the 3 playtest copies.
Yeah, I mean, it would have been horrible of me, and I would have. You know why I don't steal? Not because I'm an ethical person, because I'm the guy that always gets caught. So I guess penology, my fear of penology or going to prison really kind of works. But Matt, thank you for coming on, man. This is like I said, I asked you for the rules last night, and I read them. I actually showed them to some people I work with, but we'll talk about that offline. But go pick this game up, and you are going to a lot of events. I know in the DMV and other places that folks can actually come and play test the game with you. If you know any of those in advance, I will throw them on our Facebook page, so you can go check this game out personally. I know that it will be at the club at Quantico on the 19th, and this will be out before then. We'll try to get you on base to play it, but there will be a line behind me. So I know I have to run a game too, but I want to play this. Not so much that Littoral Commander one. I'm getting Littoraled out.
Yeah. You know, it's funny. Ironically, outside of the work I've done on this game, even though Littoral Commander has been on the streets for ages, I'm still investing an insane amount of time in, developing new scenarios and new mechanics for it. Just because you'd ask me the games I played when I was younger, and the Star Wars game was one. I played Axis and Allies like everybody else. I even have a copy of Battle Masters, like that old Hasbro game. Yeah, that's like a museum piece. Those were the games that started me though. But like the go-to game that I still continue to use is Littoral Commander, because of its sandbox tailorability, and because there's very little else like it on the market that captures the current and modern warfare challenges in a way that is relatively easy to teach to other people and get them into the game. And the framework for it is so, the core, it's got the core rules, but otherwise the framework is so flexible that, I am part of just a larger fan community that writes their own scenarios and components to it, because it lends itself to that so easily. So, yeah.
Yeah, by the way, I hate you for those scenarios, and I'll tell you why. So I've done 12 scenarios for the Baltic game. Then you come out with a new scenario. I'm like, shit. Yeah. How do I use kind of some of this stuff in there? So, I'm a great, I wouldn't say I'm a game designer of any ilk, but I know what works to steal. But every time you pop one up on either the Google Drive, or you throw it on Board Game Geek, I'm like, that's slick, man. I kind of have to throw that in the game somehow. So, but definitely check out this game, and I'll tell you something interesting about Littoral Commander when we get off the air. But thank you so much, Dietz Foundation.org. And once again, author, playwright, wargamer extraordinaire, and I guess pretty good CH-53 pilot. Beautiful aircraft.
Yeah, it was adequate.
It was adequate. Yeah.
No, I was adequate. I was an adequate pilot.
Hey, if you could fly one of those things, hats off to you. But thanks for coming on. We're gonna have you come back sometime, and love to talk gaming with you in the future. But I'm going to send it back to Sean in the studio. And once again, check out this game, DietzFoundation.org, and you will not be sorry.
Thanks so much for joining the show tonight. Remember to follow us on Twitter at No Dice, No Glory, and keep the conversation going on NoDiceNoGlory.com, now featuring our own message boards. Have a great night, everybody.